Welcome back to this conversation where we're making a case for homosexuality in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints. We're in the second half of talking about the historical context, where we just barely discussed that in the Roman Empire, we went from having gay marriage being allowed, several different kinds of homosexuality existing, to having a strict condemnation where anyone who was found engaging in it would face the death penalty. And so we're going to talk about how that changed. As a broad overview, basically what happened was one person misinterpreted biblical text regarding the law of Moses and wrote about it, and then other people basically kept it going, and then other people built on that, and it spread until eventually people used the Bible to condemn homosexuality, but the initial claim wasn't actually rooted in anything that the Bible said. Really, really, really interesting. Fasten your seatbelts, kids. Here's what happened. There's a scripture in Leviticus in the law of Moses where Moses is telling people what they can and can't do. And in these verses, he's specifically telling them what they can't eat. He mentions a few different animals like the camel, the coney, the hare, and the swine. And he says, you can't eat them because they cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof. Therefore, they are unclean to you. In the first century CE, there was a guy named Barnabas who wrote an epistle. This epistle is now considered apocryphal, but it was accepted as scripture by most early Christians, and its influence can be traced for centuries in the writings of many prominent fathers of the church. So it started off as an epistle, and then it spread, and it has significant influence in all of the writings that come after it. He read these verses in Leviticus and was trying to understand why Moses wanted to condemn these animals. He didn't feel like he totally understood. And so he wrote about it and he said, Moses said, you shall not eat the hare. Why? So that, he said, you may not become a boy molester or become made like these. For the hare grows a new anal opening each year, so that however many anuses he has lived, he has that many anuses. Nor should you eat the hyena, he said, so that you may not become an adulterer or seducer or like them. Why? Because this animal changes its gender annually and is 1 year a male and the next a female. Now, this is pretty confusing. Basically, in this passage of the epistle, Barnabas is equating law of Moses prohibitions of eating certain animals with various sexual sins. He's saying these animals shouldn't be eaten. Why is that? Let's look at the behavior. Oh, there are these behaviors. So because they have these behaviors, they must be prohibited as well as these other behaviors. So whether he intended it to apply to both sexes or not, notice in there how he only mentions a boy molester. It was specifically addressing the issue of sexual relations with minors. So it says, don't eat the hare so you don't become a boy molester. And so that was basically saying, don't molest children. However, what's important to note is that Moses never alluded to any of this. This was completely made up, completely Barnabas's opinion. And what's interesting is that Moses didn't even condemn eating a hyena. Nowhere in scripture is that mentioned, but for whatever reason, Barnabas came up with that or somehow pulled that, or maybe it was a rumor that he heard. We don't know. But not very many Christians knew the text of Leviticus well enough to recognize the distortion. And so once he published this, it started to take hold where people felt like, oh, yeah, Moses told us not to eat the hare because hares are kind of like boy molesters, and we shouldn't eat hyenas because hyenas are like adulterers. And so this started to spread. We have two books that were published shortly thereafter. And like I mentioned, they started to warp what he had written and expand upon them. And so the first is the Apostolic Constitutions. So they applied Barnabas's comments to all sexual activity between persons of the same gender. Notice how in the original text from Barnabas, he said it was specifically directed to boy molesters or to adulterers. But in this text, it said hares and hyenas are basically engaging in same-sex behavior, and so any kind of sexual activity between persons of the same gender must be condemned according to Moses. Another book came out that was written by the Clement of Alexandria. You might remember him. We mentioned him a bit earlier, but he wrote what was called the Pedagogus. I don't know if that's how you say it, but that's how we're going to say it. The Pegasus, if you will. And he wrote an extremely popular manual for Christian parents. And in that manual, he created the Alexandrian rule, which was that sex must be directed towards procreation in order to be moral. So basically, his rule was that you either have lovey time to produce children, or keep your hands and your body to yourself. And that was his opinion. But that really caught on and started to spread. And in this manual, he believed that male hyenas regularly mounted each other rather than the female. And he inferred that Moses' prohibition against eating them must be a condemnation of homosexual relations. Now, let's make sure we're clear on this. Moses never condemned eating hyenas. He never said that if you eat hyenas, you'll become an adulterer. He never said that hyenas are caught up in adultery. But somehow Barnabas came to that conclusion. Once Barnabas came to that conclusion, other Christian authors started to catch on and started to spread that sentiment. And eventually, all homosexual relations started to be condemned as justified by the Bible. It's almost like a game of telephone, if you've played that before, where you tell one thing to one person, they tell it to the next, and the next, and the next. And by the time you get to the last person, usually the message has changed. This is what we're seeing here, where Moses made a prohibition, and people read into it, and then it built on itself until it became completely distorted from the original meaning. We also see that shortly thereafter, there was a book called The Physiologist, and this was a text that used animals, plants, and stones to teach Christian morals. It exploded in popularity to the point where during the Middle Ages, it was translated into almost every language from Icelandic to Arabic. So most likely, if you were alive during this time, you were familiar with this book. You used this book as a way to understand religion and Christianity. And in this book, the author wrote that you must not, therefore, become like the hyena, taking first the male and then the female nature. These, he says, the holy apostle Moses reproached when he spoke of men with men doing that which is unseemly. So you'll notice that that quote of men with men doing that which is unseemly is actually a quote from Romans, which was written a few centuries before this book. And so this is the first place where any other scriptures in the Bible are used to condemn homosexuality. This verse in Romans is used in a modern sense to condemn homosexuality, but the first time it was referenced was based off of the scriptures referring to the hyenas. And so basically every condemnation of homosexuality from the Bible is based off of this distorted opinion that was originally written by Barnabas. But it really caught hold and really became popular. In fact, half a millennium later, the Bishop of Pavia made fun of a gay male by comparing him to a hare. And about 1,000 years after that, Bernard of Cluny condemned homosexuality by saying that a man who dishonors his maleness is just like a hyena. There were some other Christian writers who kind of got in on this and started sharing some alternate perspectives as well. There was a guy named Augustine who lived around this time, and he believed that homosexual behavior was incongruous and contrary to human custom. What's interesting is that it's documented that at some point during his adult life, he visited a popular city. And it says that while he was there, he abandoned himself to urban pleasures. We don't really know what that means, but whatever it was, he later regretted it. And he seems to have been surprised at the large numbers of persons involved in what he had previously considered extremely rare behavior. So he wrote quite a bit about how homosexuality was contrary to human custom, it was unnatural, it was rare. And then he goes to this large city and is completely surprised to see that there are people who practice it. And according to history, he may have even gotten involved himself, saying that he abandoned himself to urban pleasures. We don't know what that means, but some historians think he might have engaged in homosexuality himself. Other historians have said it is not surprising that Augustine, having grown up and retired to rural North Africa, where homosexuality was probably clandestine and publicly denigrated, should have considered it bizarre and alien. Augustine isn't the only one to condemn homosexuality, despite not having much exposure to it. It is in fact typical of theologians born in the provinces, like Jerome from what is now Yugoslavia, or Ambrose from southwest Germany, to derogate homosexual behavior. In contrast, theologians in large urban centers like Alexandria, Antioch, or Constantinople, whose flocks were exposed to open and traditionally accepted gay lifestyles, had to elaborate much more complex arguments if they wished to discourage gay sexuality. They could hardly hope to convince Christians who encountered unabashed gay people that homosexuality was against human nature, so they had to appeal to a nature other than the human one, and to cite with selectivity animals in demonstration of the workings of nature in regard to sexuality. That's a really wordy quote. Basically, what this is saying is that there are writers and theologians whose beliefs spread and who influence public opinion, who wrote about homosexual behavior, and the ones who condemned it as unnatural generally didn't have much exposure to it. And on the other hand, the writers who were exposed to it and condemned it found that they couldn't write about it being against human nature because there were so many people who did seem to be engaging in it, that how can you say, like, how can someone be convinced that this is against human nature when my friend Bill seems to be engaged in it and it seems pretty natural to him? And so instead of applying to human nature, they started applying to nature in regards to animals and saying that if hyenas and hares can engage in these same-sex behaviors and Moses condemned those animals, then that behavior must be condemned as well. The same fathers of the church, a very vocal minority, who censored homosexual behavior, also censored, no less severely, behavior which is today universally accepted by Christian communities. Some of those are lending an interest, sexual intercourse during the menstrual period, jewelry or dyed fabrics, shaving, regular bathing. It's a shame we don't ban that one, right? If only we didn't have to shower. I'm joking about that one. I actually love showering. For me, I shower for like 45 minutes every day. It's actually a problem. But moving along, wearing wigs, serving the civil government or army, performing manual labor on feast days, eating kosher foods, or practicing circumcision. All of these things were condemned absolutely by various fathers of the church due to personal prejudice, misinformation, or an extremely literal interpretation of the Bible. All condemnations of the Bible, or sorry, of homosexuality from the Bible stem from these early writers. And if we don't discard everything else that they prohibited, why do we still believe that homosexuality is prohibited? Something to think about. If you remember our friend Emperor Justinian, he was the one that enacted the death penalty in Rome. He was born in a rural village, and historians actually believe that most likely the death penalty law was enacted to provide an excuse to attack his enemies, that this law wasn't enacted for moral reasons, but rather for political ones. Um, this guy from Caesarea, he's considered the best historian of the area. I don't know how to say his name. We can call him Pocahontas. He stated that Justinian didn't concern himself with people who broke the law after it was passed. That should raise a red flag. Usually, if a law is put into place, it's because we want people to follow it moving forward. But Justinian didn't concern himself with people after the law was put into place. Rather, he sought out and prosecuted persons caught in such acts long before, targeting those who possessed great wealth or who happened to have done something else which offended the rulers. So that is really, really interesting. So he didn't condemn people after the law was put into place, but rather he put the law in place and then retroactively condemned people who had broken the law before it was enacted. And the historian Pocahontas suggests that it was most likely to condemn people who had great wealth. So people during the time who were homosexuals who had lots of money, or homosexuals at the time who, for whatever reason, Justinian had beef with from something that had happened in the past. We see another example of homosexuality being used for politics with the example of Empress Theodora. During her rule, there was a young man who made an uncomplimentary remark about her. We don't know exactly what the remark was, but she didn't like it. And so she ends up indicting him as a homosexual, removes him from the church, tortures him, and castrates him. What's kind of funny is that she tries doing this again with another man, but this man is well connected and has friends in high places. And so they come to his aid. And so the judges refuse to hear the charges about Theodora saying that this man made an uncomplimentary remark towards him and he's a homosexual. And so when the judges refuse to hear the charges, she tries bribing witnesses and even tortures one of his friends, but the judges don't give. And so the man basically doesn't encounter any problems. He doesn't, like, his life isn't ruined by Empress Theodora. And as a result, the whole city celebrated a holiday in his honor. Around this time as well, the word sodomy came into play, and sodomy was used to describe sex that was performed without the intent of procreation. So this is very similar to the Alexandrian rule, if you remember that, where basically So basically, sex should be between a man and a woman trying to make babies. Sodomy is everything else that involves sexual behavior, any kind of arousal, anything that isn't done with the intent to have children is sodomy. If we jump ahead a few hundred years, in the 11th and 12th century, attitudes actually grew more tolerant. So the death penalty was around for several hundred years. It was homosexuality was pretty restricted, pretty targeted. But then for some reason during the 11th and 12th century, it started to kind of shift a little bit. And during this time, homosexual literature boomed. And there were mainly two schools of thought. The first was that homosexual acts are sinful and comparable to murder. At this time, that was actually the minority. The second school of thought is that homosexual relations are positive and should be celebrated, and that actually seems to be the opinion of the majority. During this time, homosexuality was well attested in England, Italy, Germany, Spain, the Scandinavian countries, and even the Holy Land. So somehow it started to change and started to be more accepted. Around this time, there was a book called the Book of Gomorrah that was written by St. Peter Damian in the year 1051. And he had some opinions on homosexuality. He said, absolutely no other vice can be reasonably compared with this one. For this vice is, in fact, the death of the body, the destruction of the soul. It pollutes the flesh, extinguishes the light of the mind, and casts out the Holy Spirit. Peter Damian had some thoughts on this subject. What's funny is that this other guy named Pope Alexander II, he hears about this book that had been written by Peter Damian, and he ends up stealing the book from Peter and keeping it locked away. I included a quote from Peter Damian below, but basically, Pope Alexander II requested the book from Peter because he said he wanted to make a copy for himself. And so he gets the book and then he locks it away and he doesn't give it back. And so Peter asks for it and begs for it. And Pope Alexander II just laughs and tries to placate him. I think that's so funny. During this time, we also have the saint named Alred. I think Alred was such a sweetie, and maybe you'll relate to his story. He wrote that while I was still a schoolboy, the charm of my friends greatly captivated me, so that among the foibles and failings with which that age is fraught, my mind surrendered itself completely to emotion and devoted itself to love. Aw, he just wants to be a little lover boy. He said, nothing seems sweeter or nicer than to love and be loved. For a time, it seems that he engaged in promiscuity with other men. Most likely, this was during his youth. He referred to a period of time when a cloud of desire arose from the lower drives of the flesh and the gushing spring of adolescence, and the sweetness of love and impurity of lust combined to take advantage of the inexperience of my youth. Describing this time period, Alred wrote a letter to his sister and said that basically during his hoe phase, she held on to her virtue while he lost his. Um, Eventually, he decided to abandon all of his loves and decided to seek a relationship with God because he decided that his other lovers wouldn't last forever, but his relationship with God would, and he became a monk. Turns out if you're gay outside of a monastery, you're gay inside of one too. And so he ends up falling in love with two monks during his service. The first is named Simon. He wrote that the rules of our order forbade us to speak, but his, Simon, face spoke to me, his bearing spoke to me, and his silence talked. For many years, Alred referred to Simon as his beloved, and when Simon died, Alred said he could barely live and was inconsolable. The second monk, I tried finding a name for him, but I couldn't locate one. But there was another monk who was a man who Alred seemed to have a special and intimate relationship with. He wrote, we attained that stage at which we had but one mind and one soul, to will and not to will alike. For I deemed my heart in a fashion his, and his mine, and he felt in like manner towards me. He was the refuge of my spirit, the sweet solace of my griefs, whose heart of love received me. And then he has this quote that I adore. He said, feelings are not ours to command. We are attracted to some against our will, while towards others we can never experience a spontaneous affection. Thank you, Alred. Moving forward, we have the 13th and 14th century. And this is where things started to change again, where condemnation of homosexuality became a mainstream practice again. During this time, laws were enacted that really affected minorities. So, women at this time steadily lost power. Poor were considered the cause of social unrest. So, you either had money or you were a problem that needed to be taken care of. Jews were cast out of England and France, and an explosion of new laws and restrictions were enacted. Um, so between 1250 and 1300, homosexual activity passed from being completely legal in most of Europe to incurring the death penalty again in all but a few situations. And often death was prescribed for a single proved act. So if someone engaged in a homosexual act, even just once, they would be put to death. During this time, there was a guy named Peter Cantor who had some writings. Apparently, if you were alive during the Middle Ages and your name was Peter, you hated homosexuals, and he interpreted scripture to condemn homosexuality, specifically using the word sodomy. Like we mentioned before, sodomy, that word comes from Sodom and Gomorrah. But Peter was the first one to specifically tie sodomy with strict homosexuality. Instead of sodomy being referred to use as any act of sex outside of having children, he referred to sodomy specifically as sex between two men. Um, and in writing about Sodom and Gomorrah, he said, "Why is it that what the Lord punished so severely, the church leaves untouched?" As you can imagine, he became a vocal advocate against homosexuality and tried to enact laws and tried to persuade public opinion to continue condemning it and to keep the death penalty going. There was a council that was held in 1179 by many of the influential leaders at the time, and they came together and imposed sanctions against moneylenders, heretics, Jews, Muslims, mercenaries, and those who commit homosexual acts. So basically, um, minorities were targeted during this time, and homosexuals just happened to be one of them. As this legislation against homosexuals continued, we have what was the last homosexual monarch. He was born in England, and he actually married a woman named Isabella and had four kids, but he never really seemed to love her. Historians believe that this was a marriage that was done out of obligation instead of desire. When he was a teenager, he fell in love with a guy named Pierce Gaveston, but Edward's dad didn't approve of the relationship. So the king at the time exiled Pierce. It's said that Edward's dad and Pierce got along, but because it was two men, because of the nature of the relationship, the king exiled him. So eventually, Edward's dad dies. So Edward comes to power, and when he comes into power, he brings Pierce back, and he says, "Where you been? Let's catch up." And so they start getting all lovey again. Um, but Parliament disagrees, and Parliament exiles Pierce again, and so he gets banished. And so then Edward brings him back, and then he gets banished again, and Edward brings him back, and then this time he gets brought back, and then he's murdered, and so Edward loses his lover. It's written that in regards of Edward's love for Pierce, that his love went beyond the love of women, and he delighted inordinately in the vice of sodomy. It said that he was ardently in love with one of his friends. From this cause came shame to the lover, hatred to the beloved, scandal to the kingdom, or sorry, scandal to the people, and harm to the kingdom. Juicy or whatever. Um, Edward was in love with Gaveston for 13 years, and they were faithful and steadfast the whole time. Many years after Pierce's death, though, or Gaveston's death, Edward fell in love with Hugh Lee Despenser, who was another man. And interestingly, during this time, obviously, if Edward is going after these men, then Isabella isn't just going to hang around. And so she ends up entering a relationship with a guy named Mortimer of Wingmore. Now, I don't know how Isabella felt good leaving a guy named Edward for a guy named Mortimer, but she did. And so even though Isabella and Edward are married, they're both pursuing these other interests. But Isabella does the same thing that Empress Theodosia did, if you remember, and she starts using homosexuality as a political means. And so she rallies up all of these people in England, and specifically the barons, to revolt against Edward, claiming that because Edward is a homosexual, he should be killed. And so eventually they do overtake the kingdom, And Edward and Hugh are both killed in pretty gruesome manners. I won't go into detail, but it's pretty awful. And thus ended the last homosexual monarch. Moving forward, in the 15th and 17th century, not much changed. The death penalty was still enacted, or there were severe punishments for people who were convicted of homosexuality. And there were some writers at the time that I wanted to include here. The French jurist said, a French jurist said, the penalty for sodomy cannot be harsh enough to expiate a crime that makes nature blush. A British jurist said, sodomy is a crime not fit to be named. So even though there's this condemnation and public opinion is totally against homosexuality, there were still cases of sodomy that were pretty widespread and frequent. And there were people who were in support of it. There was a French writer who wrote, if the sodomite truly is a scoundrel or a monster, then why has nature created him partial to this pleasure? What you'll see if you haven't already is that throughout history, there's almost always been people who have been in favor of homosexuality and people who have condemned it, but the reasons behind both have been very different. If we keep moving forward to the 18th and 19th century, homosexuality was still criminalized, but less severely so. So instead of saying we're going to kill anyone who engages in homosexual acts, they decided we're just going to lock them up for life. Obviously, depending on the country and the society, it may have been more severe or less severe, but usually it involves some kind of imprisoning. And for second offenses, then the death penalty would be enacted. So we have this guy, though, who I think is amazing. I hope that when I die, I get to heaven and I meet this man and we become best friends. He seems so cool. His name is Joseph Fielding, and he was a writer, a civil servant, and a secret agent. And during this time, he lived in an openly gay relationship with the writer Theodore L. And he has this quote that I adore. He said, when one has a vice, one should know how to wear it. Joseph, you're my hero. I want to meet this man someday. During this time, there was a tailor who was arrested and then imprisoned for homosexuality, and he said, I can't help it. It's in my blood. There was a Dutch pamphlet that was produced as well that said, everybody knows that these scoundrels openly speak of their gruesome lusts as something that is natural and proper to them. And so as a result, we started to see the introduction of the term homosexual. Remember in the beginning when we talked about homosexuality, or the word homosexual didn't exist before the 1860s. Basically, it was introduced in the 1860s because people started to recognize that instead of just being behaviors, there might be some kind of orientation behind it. However, the word homosexual was often associated with being sick, perverse, or degenerate. And shortly in the future, it'll be considered a mental disorder. And so that's interesting to look out for. Lesbian at the time was of little interest to doctors, though. They thought of it as marginal significance or doubted its existence. Why? I don't know. Let's go back and ask them. Around this time, some measures were taken to support homosexuality. In German, there was a committee that was founded. You can look at that W word there. I don't know how to pronounce that. It's the Make-A-Wish Foundation, and they sought to educate the public about homosexuality to reduce prejudice. And so they created a petition that was actually signed by several really influential people, including Albert Einstein and Leo Tolstoy. And this petition demanded that homosexual men wouldn't be imprisoned for engaging in homosexual acts. In England, a few years later, there was another organization that was founded that was called the British Society for the Study of Sex Psychology. And one of the objectives was to decriminalize homosexuality. Throughout this time, there were efforts that were being made. But in Paris, homosexuality was bumping, and it was pretty widely accepted that you could come, and Paris was like a homosexual party. Throughout the world, homosexual bars and gatherings would be organized, but they often wouldn't last long because there would either be raids that would shut it down or the government would shut it down. In the mid-1950s, Alfred Kinsey, maybe that name sounds familiar with the Kinsey scale, if you've ever heard of that before. He wrote that there appears to be no other culture in the world in which homosexual relationships were so severely penalized. This is important to note because as far as the church goes, almost all of the prophets and apostles until the last few years have been from the United States. So the culture and the perspectives that we have in the United States have played a big impact on the church leaders. So, understanding that in the US, homosexual relationships were completely penalized in a way that wasn't true in other parts of the world. Another historian wrote that not only was the United States the only major power in the world that excluded homosexuals from its armed services and government employment, this is during World War I and World War II. The sociologist Donald Webster Corey wrote a decade later, the homosexual is the only individual who is punished in this manner, not only for any activities that may be indulged in, but for harboring the desire to perform such activities. Not only could gay people be criminalized for acting on it, they could be criminalized just for identifying or for desiring it, which is interesting because we don't see that with any other kind of vice or crime. Like if someone wants to steal, that's a lot different from actually stealing. If someone wants to commit adultery, that's a lot different from actually doing the act. But with homosexuality, it didn't matter. If the desire was there, they were criminalized. Next up, we have this story from Marcus Braun. He was an immigrant inspector. He visited Europe and saw some cases of homosexuality. And so he came back to the United States and urged that male and female prostitutes, as well as pederasts and sodomites, should be deported from the United States. If at the time of their detection, they should be found to become citizens of the United States, their citizen papers should be declared null and void. So he started pushing for the Bureau of Immigration to scan for perverts. And if people were sufficiently homosexual, then they wouldn't be allowed into the country. Or if there were people from other parts of the world who had legally immigrated here, if it was found out that they were homosexuals, then they would be deported. During immigration exams, the examiners would be required to ask questions like, are you married? Do you want to marry? Do you care for the opposite sex? Are you in love? And immigration officials would actually scan genitals of people who were entering the country. And they concluded that aliens with malformed genitals were prone to perversion, and that perverted anatomy led to perverse acts. So literally they would start scanning naked bodies of people coming in the country, and if the naked bodies didn't seem strong enough or masculine enough, then they wouldn't be allowed citizenship. So like it says here, in 1950, immigration law explicitly barred aliens alleged to be homosexual from entering or remaining in the country. We have a specific example of this. This is kind of a sad example. In 1960, there were these two men who were from Canada. They spent a night together in Toronto, and then they moved to the US. While they were in the US, they continued living together. While they were living together, their landlady reported them because she read letters between the two that were written in an endearing and effeminate manner, and that seemed to indicate that both men had been addicted to indecent, unnatural, and immoral practices. So they were forced to meet with officials and be interrogated. And during the interrogation, the two men admitted to calling each other sweethearts and lovers. And further investigation found that one man had sent the other man a ring with an engraving that said, "Love finds its way," from George to Jim. The man who sent the ring was immediately deported, and the other man left the country before his case was finalized. As far as the Bible goes, we recall that in 1869, homosexual was the first time the word was used, and that was in Germany. In 1946, the word homosexual was first used in the English translations of the Bible, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. The Bible didn't have the word homosexual until 1946. And considering all of the other political and social factors that were contributing to it, it doesn't necessarily seem like that usage was led by divine inspiration. And what's also interesting is that about 40 years after it was used in the English translation, homosexual was used in the German translation of the Bible and paid for by the US. And I couldn't tell for sure, but it seems like the US actually paid for other translations in other languages, specifically so that homosexual could be added to it. Also, throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI, and police departments kept lists of known homosexuals and their favored establishments and friends. The U.S. Postal Office kept track of addresses where material pertaining to homosexuality was mailed. State and local governments followed suit. Bars catering to gay men and lesbians were shut down, and their customers were arrested and exposed in newspapers. Cities performed sweeps to rid neighborhoods, parks, bars, and beaches of gay people. They outlawed the wearing of opposite gender clothes, and universities expelled instructors suspected of being homosexual. So during the early to mid 1900s, there's all of these efforts being made to condemn homosexuals and to either imprison them or get them out of the country. In 1969, we start to see gay people rise up against it during the Stonewall riots. Basically, gays and lesbians were at this bar having the time of their lives, and then police raided it. For the first time, gays and lesbians fought back against it, and then it really started to unify the LGBTQ community and really started the gay rights activism. In the 1980s, there was the AIDS crisis. AIDS was originally called the gay related immune deficiency, and governments initially didn't do anything about it because it seemed to only affect homosexuals. And so they basically just washed their hands and said, if homosexuals are against nature, if they're perverse, then they deserve this, and maybe this is coming from God. The worries about the disease only began to spread once heterosexuals began to contract AIDS. Um, so it wasn't until the main population started to be affected that anything was done about it. In 1987, Barney Frank was the first openly gay U.S. congressman. In 1998, in Zimbabwe, former President Canaan Banana was convicted for sodomy, kind of an unfortunate last name for his crime if you think about it. In 1999, in Malaysia, the Deputy Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim was convicted as well. And then in 2001, 7% of the members of parliament in the Netherlands were openly gay or lesbian. In the past, the West attributed homosexuality to the inhabitants of Africa and Asia. But nowadays, Africa and Asia locate the origin of the homosexual disease as the West. And so now both sides are pointing fingers at each other, and this has led to widespread anti homosexual sentiment. I wanted to include this slide to kind of give you some perspective on different things that were happening throughout the world and that influenced modern day politics. Along similar lines, I wanted to include a timeline of countries that have legalized same sex marriages. The first was Denmark in 1989, and then you can follow the rest of the list. The United States didn't legalize it across the whole country until 2015. So I hope this puts in perspective that this is a pretty recent thing, that same sex marriage has been condemned and has been really outlawed for several hundreds of years, and now we're just barely beginning to allow it, and we haven't really seen the actual repercussions of it. So how can we condemn it if we haven't taken time to understand it? Along similar lines, roughly 65 countries still criminalize consensual same-sex acts. Roughly 38 countries have legalized same-sex marriage, and at least 7 countries apply the death penalty for same-sex conduct as of 2026. And around 36 countries define marriage in their constitution strictly as between a man and a woman. To help us get a well-rounded perspective, I wanted to share this chart. So areas where there's darker green means there's greater acceptance of homosexuality. Areas where it's white means that there's no acceptance of homosexuality. So you can take a look at that for a second if you want. Just kind of interesting to look at and see where homosexuality tends to be accepted and where it's not. This was released in 2020 by the Pew Research Center. This is another chart from the same report released by the Pew Research Center, and they reported that wealthier countries tend to be more accepting of homosexuality. On the left side, the 0 to 100% shows acceptance. On the bottom, the dollar signs basically represent the general wealth of the population. And so we see that the countries that tend to have lower wealth tend to have lower acceptance, and countries that tend to have more wealth tend to have more acceptance. Why? I'm not sure, but something interesting to think about. As far as things are going in 2026, LGBTQ plus young people are more than 4 times as likely to attempt suicide than their peers. The Trevor Project estimates that more than 1.8 million LGBTQ plus young people, so ages 13 to 24, seriously consider suicide each year in the US. And get this, at least one attempts suicide every 45 seconds. That is heartbreaking. The Trevor Project's 2024 U.S. National Survey on the Mental Health of LGBTQ plus young people found that 39% of LGBTQ young people seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, including roughly half of transgender and non-binary youth. What's interesting is that throughout history, the last few hundred years, homosexual people were often killed by other people, but now we're getting to a point where homosexual people are more often killing themselves. And I think that's probably due to a lack of acceptance, or I don't know why, but I think that's something to think about. I wanted to research different medical associations. And so I found that this list of medical associations, and these all report that homosexuality is a natural variation in human sexuality and that gay people can be just as happy as straight people. So there's a few to look at. So, and to sum up all of this historical context, I know that was a lot, but basically, homosexuality has existed in some form in nearly every society throughout all of history. And every condemnation of it seems to stem from some kind of Christian morality, which is based off of writings from people who often misinterpreted sacred texts. Those same people likely had little to no exposure to what they were actually condemning, but their beliefs have been rooted into modern religion and society. Now that we have this historical context in mind, we see what has influenced our perspective in the modern era. We're going to take a look at what the actual sources say in the scriptures and prophets and apostles and see if we continue forming a complete opinion about whether or not God condemns same sex relationships. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next video.